Is Attorney Jennings in the courtroom?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning. You can approach one of the microphones, Attorney Jennings. The court received a copy of a draft protective order this morning. Attorney Jennings, were copies of the draft given to both counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. I was told that my office sent them over yesterday afternoon, but I do have an extra copy for the state that I can provide them with right now.
Thank you.
The court is going to read the pertinent portions of the protective order into the record. Yesterday, this court did deny the motion to quash and indicated that it would consider a protective order if one was drafted. The pertinent section of the protective order is that Attorney Michael Rose shall not offer testimony on any matters involving his direct communications of legal advice and strategy with his former client, Michelle Dulos. Additionally, it is further ordered that Attorney Michael Rose shall not offer testimony regarding any documents that have been sealed by the court in Mr. Dulos' divorce proceeding. Attorney Schoenhorn, do you wish to be heard?
If I may just review the language for one moment. That's fine, Your Honor. And I'll just note I have discussed that. In fact, what I believed would have been the limits directly with Attorney Rose, and that was, of course, with permission of Mr. Rose's counsel, Jeffrey Ment. So I have no problem with the language as proposed here.
Thank you. So the court will enter the protective order. It is now an order of the court. Thank you, Attorney Jennings.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Are you ready with your witnesses, Attorney Schoenhorn?
I am, Your Honor.
Thank you. We can bring the jury in, please. Would counsel stipulate, please?
Yes, Judge. Yes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
The defense continues with its case. Attorney Schoenhorn.
The defense calls Professor Elizabeth Loftus, please.
You could please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or solemnly and sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that the evidence you shall give concerning this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, or upon penalty of perjury?
I do.
Please state your name and spell it for the record.
My name is Elizabeth Loftus. It's L-O-F as in Foxtrot, T-U-S as in Sierra.
Professor, you may be seated.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may inquire, counsel.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor Loftus.
Good morning.
Would you please indicate to the members of the jury what your present occupation is?
I'm currently a distinguished professor at the University of California, Irvine.
Could you tell the jury what areas, you're a professor there?
Yes.
Could you tell the members of the jury in what areas you instruct?
Well, I'm an experimental psychologist. I specialize in human memory, and I teach courses in eyewitness testimony and memory.
Could you indicate how long have you been at the University of California at Irvine?
Approximately 22 years.
Did you have a career prior to being at Irvine?
I did, yes.
Could you tell the jury where you were before that?
Well, before UC Irvine, I was on the faculty at the University of Washington in Seattle for 29 years.
Prior to Irvine?
Right, then I was recruited by UC Irvine in 2002.
Are you in a particular department at UC Irvine?
Well, I'm in the Department of Psychological Science. Another department is Criminology, Law, and Society, and I'm also a professor of law.
Could you indicate what academic degrees you hold?
Well, starting with college, I guess. I have a bachelor's degree from UCLA. I majored in mathematics and also psychology. That was 1966. Then I went to Stanford and received my master's degree in psychology and then a PhD in psychology in 1970.
Showing you what has been previously marked as Exhibit II for identification. I'm just going to ask if this is a copy of your most recent curriculum vitae or resume.
Yes, it is.
I would offer it.
I have no objection.
Do you need it for?
Well,
I ask-
in case I might need to look something up.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Does it need to be marked as full?
Well, it's II, correct?
Yes.
II marked as full.
Could you indicate to the members of the jury what kind of background research that you've been involved in over the years connected to your field?
Well, in all these years that I've been a professor, I've been studying human memory. And so I don't know how much detail you want about that, but basically the kind of work that I do is to expose people to simulated events, usually crimes, accidents, or other events, and study their memory for what they witnessed. Or sometimes we plant entire memories into the minds of people for purposes of studying how distorted or false memories develop.
You indicated that this was simulated. Is that the term you used?
Yes, in many of the studies, we will stage events in front of people or show them a film of an event. For example, that's what I mean by simulated.
Do you also study situations of real-life incidents and memories?
Well, I do study many real-life incidents, but I've also been involved in research where the events aren't simulated. People are experiencing something very upsetting, arousing, traumatic, and their memory isn't being tested. For example, in a couple of the studies, there are soldiers who are going to survival school. They're learning what it's going to be like if they're ever captured as prisoners of war, and I've been a collaborator on a research team studying their memories and the extent to which they can be led to develop false beliefs or false memories.
When you worked with these soldiers, who was that for? What was the funding for that particular study?
I worked with a psychiatrist named Dr. Charles Morgan, who's been studying these soldiers for a long time. And in a few of his studies, I collaborated with him, and we introduced certain measures that were similar to the kinds of things that I do in my other research. So I can't really tell you where he was getting his funding, but he was in cooperation with the military.
In cooperation with the actual military departments.
Yes,
Could you tell us whether you hold any honorary degrees?
I do.
Could you let the jury know?
I have 8 honorary doctorates, a couple of them from universities in the United States, a couple of them from universities in Great Britain, one from the University of Oslo, one from Australian National University, that's the most recent one from Haifa in Israel, and there may be some others that I'm hopefully not forgetting.
Are they in your,
Yes.
you don't have to look them up, but are they
Okay.
in the CV if the jury wants to look at that document?
Yes.
Do you also have any fellowships that you have received?
Well, I've received fellowships over the years. For example, I went to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford 1 year, took a leave from the University of Washington. That would be one example.
Have you received any grants for your work?
I've received many grants from the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Mental Health, Department of Transportation, the U.S. Department of Transportation, for my studies on memory.
As part of your work doing research, have you prepared papers and reports with regard to your actual studies and the outcomes that you had found?
Many, many times, yes.
And were they published?
Well, I've published, I don't know, over 20 books and well over 600 scientific articles and chapters, primarily describing this scientific work, and these are all listed in this CV.
Right, I'm not going to ask you to go through them, but they are listed in there.
Yes, they are.
Can you tell us whether any of those papers and other books that you published were peer-reviewed?
I would say probably the majority of them are peer-reviewed.
Could you just explain very briefly to the jury what peer review means?
Well, when a scientist submits an article to a journal and hopes to see the article published in that journal, the editor of the journal will send out the article to some reviewers. Depending on the practices of the journal, it might be 3 reviewers, it might be 2, or it might be somewhat more. And those reviewers make a recommendation about whether the quality of the work, whether it's worthy of scientific publication, whether it's appropriate for that journal. So that is the peer review process, and many of my articles have been through that process. But I might also add that I serve on and have served on many editorial boards myself and been a peer reviewer of the work of other scientists.
When we talk about the word peer, are we talking about other scientists that are in the same field as you and therefore are knowledgeable, as opposed to, let's say, editor of a magazine or something like that?
Yes, they would go to other scientists for their reactions, and those scientists would presumably be working in the same field.
Are you a member of any professional organizations related to your field?
Yes, I'm a member of a number of organizations. For example, the Association for Psychological Science is maybe a major organization for research academic psychologists. And I was president of that organization, I think, in 1998. I'm a member of the Western Psychological Association, which covers the western region of the United States, which is where I live and work. And I was president of that organization twice. I'm a member of a number of other organizations, some of them elected positions.
Are they in your CV as well?
Yes, for example, the National Academy of Sciences, which is an organization with members who are elected from all areas of science.
Now, I'm not going to go through your entire CV, but how many pages is it, so at least the jury knows in advance how long it is?
48 pages,
And it's mostly single-spaced?
single-spaced, yes.
All right, so we won't go through all the 43 pages. Have you published articles, books, and in journals?
Yes.
Approximately how many over the years in the field of science of memory?
Well, as I testified, I've published over 600 articles. I have published on a few other topics occasionally, but the vast majority of the articles are in the area of memory.
Could you just indicate whether or not you yourself, as the author, have published full books?
Yes, I've authored or co-authored over 20 books.
They in the CV as well?
Yes, yes.
And approximately how many research experiments have you conducted in your career in the area of memory and the psychology and science of memory?
I don't know how many experiments. It would be hundreds and hundreds of experiments involving tens and tens of thousands of people.
You also teach?
I do, yes.
Do you have research assistants in your field that you mentor and teach?
Yes, graduate students who are working on their PhDs, undergraduate research assistants, sometimes who are in the honors program, for example, maybe working on an honors thesis, so I might be supervising. We have something called a post-bac program, which is a program of individuals who are wanting some extra experience after they've already graduated college. I mentor those frequently.
Have you ever testified as an expert in court in the field of memory?
Many times, yes.
Could you give a ballpark figure of the number of times?
I've testified, over 300 times in trials since June 3rd, 1975.
Have you also testified at hearings that may not have involved a full trial, maybe in front of a judge or a magistrate?
I've testified in hearings, or I've testified in depositions and other kinds of situations where you're under oath.
Do you testify in both civil and criminal cases?
I do.
Can you just, without naming the 300 cases, just indicate in what some of the jurisdictions where you've testified as an expert?
Well, I've testified in many different states in the United States, including Connecticut. I've testified in federal court. I've testified in military trials. I've testified twice in South Korea and once in Israel in a trial. Maybe some other countries that I'm not remembering. Maybe, a couple of times in Canada.
Have you ever consulted with government agencies in your field as an expert in memory?
I have. I've and these are listed on the CV too, but I've consulted with the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, and other agencies.
Have you ever been retained by the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice?
Yes, I've consulted with them on the crime victimization survey, I think, but that was a long time ago.
Incidentally, when you do testify an expert, do you get compensated for your time?
Usually, yes. Sometimes, occasionally, it's a pro bono situation. And every now and then, I expect to be compensated, but it doesn't happen, and I might get mad. But mostly, I am compensated for my time.
Have you been compensated up till now in this case?
Yes.
So was there a business agreement, a contract that was signed with my office some time ago?
Yes.
And it lists
3 years ago, I believe.
And it lists the hourly rate?
Well, I believe at the time I was charging $600 an hour at the time we made our agreement, and I have agreed to stick to that figure.
And is it set forth in the agreement?
Yes.
May I approach?
Yes.
Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit SS. Can you tell us if that's the written agreement that that you and my office entered into?
Yes.
And when was it that we entered into that agreement?
Well, we signed it in August 2020.
And prior to now, have you and I consulted about the case?
A number of times, yes.
And you billed for your time consulting with me, right?
Yes.
I would offer Exhibit SS. I have no objection.
Double S admitted as well.
And I'm just going to show the jury, if I may. Yeah. Oh. Didn't work.
Make a little cheat sheet for everybody.
Just do me a favor, show me what you press so I can,
Just press this button.
until it goes to the,
Almost number 2.
oh, got it, okay.
Like that.
Right.
There you go.
And I'm not going to go through it right now, but if I show you, the- that was a cord. Show you Exhibit SS here. Is this the agreement?
Yes.
And it shows under consultant fees, the rate you're charging right
Yes.
here? Okay. And this is your signature, electronic signature, and my signature on the last page here?
My actual signature, yes.
Okay. And I also just want the jury, if I could have your CV for one moment, please?
Sure.
And noting, this is Exhibit II, and the date, October 2023, is that the date you revised? This was the most recent printed CV.
Yes.
And just turning it over so the jury knows what we're talking about, this is the first page of your CV?
Yes.
Okay. You want to keep it there for the moment?
If you are asking me some questions, it might help. Thank you.
Thank you. Incidentally, in those cases where you have testified as an expert, did it involve the issues of various influences on memory and the brain?
Memory, yes. That's a frequent topic of expert testimony.
Does your expertise include explaining how memory works or whether there are stages of memory?
Yes.
Could you just very briefly tell the jury how that works,
Well,
based on your research, obviously?
yeah, so just to be brief and simple, memory does not work like a recording device. We don't just record the event and play it back later the way a recorder would work. The process is more complex, and as scientists, we tend to divide that process into a number of stages. So, for example, an event happens or some events happen and some information comes into a person's memory. That's called the acquisition stage. Then time passes and memory fades. You don't need a PhD to know that. But what happens when time passes, we call that the retention stage. Some factors can come into play that can affect memory. The final stage is retrieval. That's when someone tries to remember what happened at the event, tries to answer questions, tries to tell in their own words what happened, tries to testify in court. So our job as scientists is to identify and study the factors that come into play at each of those stages that affect the accuracy of somebody's memory. And my work has tended to focus on that retention stage. Once the event is over and bits and pieces of information have been stored in memory, what happens to that memory and how does it get contaminated or distorted or changed, and how does that happen?
Does memory form or get stored differently for startling events versus routine events?
Well, typically with a shocking event, people, have certainly a better memory for the fact that the event itself happened. Sometimes their memory can be distorted for various details about that shocking event. But in general, you're going to probably remember more about a shocking event than a mundane event.
Is the concept of inconsistency in memory retention, is it common or not common?
We do talk about inconsistencies when somebody's memory changes from one point in time to another. They are expressing an inconsistency. Sometimes I just talk about a change in memory.
Were you asked to review any materials in specific connection to the case of Michelle Troconis as part of your being retained to consult with me?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your question, but yes, I did review various legal documents, interviews of the defendant by law enforcement, lots of media coverage about the case that might potentially have affected people's recollections.
Well, specifically with regard to the interrogation interviews, what did you review?
I reviewed interrogations that took place in June of 2019 and in August of 2019, for example.
Did you review videos or just transcripts?
Well, I reviewed the whole transcripts and large parts of the videos as well.
As part of your coming here to testify today, did you prepare a report about your area and your opinions?
Well, I did prepare a brief report because it was a very last-minute thing that would try to lay out some of the areas about which possible expert testimony might take place.
May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what has been marked as TT for identification and ask if this is the report you prepared.
Yes, it is.
And when did you prepare it?
Well, it's dated February 16th, 2024, so
Recent.
recent, yes.
Okay. I'd offer it as a full exhibit, Your Honor.
I have no objection, Judge.
Is that TT?
Yes.
Yes.
Defense's TT admitted as full.
You indicated a little while ago about some of your experiments in suggestion or of false memory. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Have you been involved in any research regarding post-event suggestion?
Well, I would say that many of my studies involve the study of post-event suggestion. And that if there's one area within the field of human memory that I've probably contributed the most to, it would be that area.
Could you just explain briefly what that means, post-event suggestion?
So after some event occurs, sometimes people are exposed to new information. They have conversations with other people. They are interrogated. They are exposed to media coverage. They get new information. And one of the things that we and other scientists have discovered is that that post-event information, particularly if it's misleading, can contaminate or distort or transform somebody's memory. Just in one of my experiments, for example, we showed people a simulated accident where a car goes through an intersection with a yield sign, and by asking a leading question that suggests that it was a stop sign, we get many people, many of these research witnesses, to tell us they remember seeing a stop sign, not a yield sign. So that's just one experimental example where, otherwise healthy, ordinary adults are led through post-event suggestion to remember details that are different from the way they really happened.
Does post-event suggestion lead to contamination of memory?
It can. I mean, sometimes people will resist the suggestion and stick with the original memory, but many times they will succumb to the suggestion, fall sway to the suggestion, and adopt it as their own memory. And they really believe, these are not people who are lying, these are people who really believe in what they're saying.
Is the nature of the questioning, you mentioned leading questions as an example, is the nature of interrogation or question technique play a role in either post-event suggestion or memory contamination?
Yes, when people ask leading questions, it is more likely to contaminate somebody's memory.
What about suggestion during a question of something that's not true? Can that lead to the same kind of problem of memory contamination?
Absolutely.
Could you explain that?
And in fact, that's what we do in these experiments. We suggest things that aren't true and look to see the conditions under which people will adopt that misinformation and incorporate it into their memory and cause a transformation or a change in the memory.
Could you give the jury an example of one of those experiments that you conducted that led to that conclusion?
Well, the yield sign, stop sign example is one example. In other experiments, for example, we've shown people accidents and asked a question like how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Other witnesses are asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And people will tell you the cars were going faster if you use the verb smashed than if you use the verb hit. And moreover, they're more likely to later tell you that they saw broken glass that did not exist. So that's just another example of how post-event questioning can contaminate somebody's memory. In the study with the soldiers who were going to survival school, we suggested that there were objects in the interrogation room, that they underwent a grueling 30-minute, horrible, and aggressive interrogation, and these soldiers were asked about it later. Well, we planted information that there was a telephone in the interrogation room, that there was a weapon when there wasn't, that the main interrogator was wearing glasses when he didn't. And a number of these soldiers picked up on the suggestion and claimed to have actually seen these non-existent objects.
No, I'm not going to ask you percentages, but would you indicate that it was just a few or a substantial number of the subjects started to recite information or restate information that was in fact implanted but didn't actually exist?
It depends on, I don't mean to be difficult, but it depends on the conditions. So in the yield sign, stop sign study, if we tried to manipulate their memory, after a half hour, we weren't as successful. If we waited a week, we could get 80% of the people to tell us, to buy into the misinformation and tell us that that's what they remember. In the study with the soldiers, by the time we were done, I think over 90% of them were remembering the telephone, and maybe closer to 20% or so remembering the weapon or the glasses, which did not exist.
And when you say over by the time it was done, over what period of time did that study go where you're asking the same subjects these questions?
Well, again, different studies are using different time periods. In the work with the traffic signs, sometimes we tested shortly after the event, sometimes we waited a week. In the studies that have been done with soldiers, it might be days later.
As time passes, did you find from your studies that there's more contamination, that the number of false memories increases?
Yes, that's a common finding too. During the retention stage, after some event is over, again, memory starts to fade. And again, most people know that memory fades over time. What's not quite so much a matter of common sense is that as that memory is fading, it becomes more and more susceptible to contamination from post-event suggestion.
Does that also affect when a person later tries to retrieve or recall the information? Does that also go up exponentially, or at least as time goes by, sort of an increased level, the longer the time that is at issue?
Well, I would put it slightly differently, that as more and more time passes, and witnesses, people in general, are more susceptible to misinformation, and so they make more mistakes when they're trying to retrieve what happened at the time of the initial event.
In your experiments and in your experience, does it matter over that period of time, if it's false information, whether the individual appears more confident or less confident about the information, whether or not it was implanted, that is, as a false memory?
When you expose people to misinformation, they can sometimes be more confident about the misinformation than they are about accurate information. Typically, you might think that somebody is going to be more confident about things that they're accurate about. But when misinformation is introduced into the environment, that whole relationship with confidence can be disrupted.
Are you familiar in your field with studies that have been conducted in regard to police interviewing techniques and their effect on memory?
Yes.
And could you tell us in general what those studies have shown?
Well, I'm familiar with work on interviewing techniques.
In general?
Interviewing techniques in general. And one of the things that again, that I know from colleagues in my field who write about police interviews in particular is, in fact, sometimes the police introduce information into those interviews that is new information, is misinformation. And so it's a kind of a setting that is ripe for potentially contaminating somebody's memory. And they may not do it deliberately to contaminate memory. They may have some other goals in mind, but when they introduce misinformation, they can affect what the person they're interviewing says.
Are you aware that in jurisdictions such as Connecticut, police are permitted to convey false information to a person they are interrogating?
Well, I don't know exactly about Connecticut, but in many jurisdictions, the police are permitted to lie to people. They're permitted to tell people that they flunked the polygraph when they didn't, or their fingerprints were found at the scene when they weren't. They can lie to them, and they're permitted to do that. And I personally think that that is not a very good practice.
Well, in any event, can you tell us what the studies have shown if an individual has been fed deliberately false information, how that affects memory?
Well, I'm actually going to object to that question, Judge. It's vague because we're talking about, on the one hand, experiments that the doctor has done, which she's testified to. Then we're talking about police interrogation, so I think the question needs to be sharpened.
Well, the court as it listens to the testimony of this witness, the witness is sharpening the question. So overruled.
I'm sorry, I forgot the question, but you know how memory is. Just repeat
We
the
waited too
question.
long. We waited too long. The question, as I may change the words a bit, but the point was, are there studies, are you familiar with studies, or have you been involved in studies where information by police has been given to someone being interrogated that was deliberately false, in other words, knowingly false by the questioner, and how that has affected memory?
Well, there are many, many experiments where witnesses have been given, by somebody interrogating them, knowingly false information. I can't say I have a lot of examples of police actually doing that, in their interrogation. But if it has happened, or if it does happen, then we know from the science that it could contaminate somebody's memory and lead them to want to adopt the misinformation or maybe make a change in their memory to accommodate the misinformation.
Does the role of the questioner play, or let me rephrase that, is the position of the questioner, does that play a role in whether or not false information or false memories can be implanted?
Well, the answer is yes, but let me explain. So a witness has seen some event or had an experience, is now being exposed to misinformation, and as I've testified, that misinformation has the potential to contaminate or distort memory. There are several studies that show that the source of that misinformation matters, that people are more likely to accept misinformation if it comes from a source that they think is knowledgeable or they think is not trying to deliberately mislead them. I mean, there's even one study with children that shows that children will accept misinformation more from an adult than they will from another child. So these are experimental examples or scientific examples of how we know that the source of the misinformation does matter.
One of the things that you said in your report is that post-event suggestion can be particularly powerful when it is an authority figure who is engaged in the activity. Could you just explain what you mean by that?
Well, again, I would relate that to an authority figure who a witness might presume is knowledgeable. And then we know from the study that people, when they think you're knowledgeable, you're more likely to be influenced by that misinformation.
Would your opinion include police officers as being authority figures?
Well, I would think they would be, because many people have a lot of respect for police officers.
What about significant others or loved ones, information conveyed from them to the subject? Would that play a role in retrieving false memories or creating false memories?
I'm going to object, Foundation.
Well, the parameters of the question the original question concerned authority figures.
Right.
Now the question has changed to loved ones or people who are close to the person whose memory is being tested. So this is a different question.
Yes.
Different parameters overruled.
I don't know that I can think of a specific study that compared whether misinformation was introduced by a loved one or introduced by a stranger. So I'm not able to think of a scientific study that would, make me comfortable answering that question based on science.
Earlier you did say that a trusted source was one such example that could result in those kind of contaminated memory.
Right, because one of the studies showed that if it looked like the person was trying to deceive you or something, you might be more resistant to them. But if it didn't look like they were in any way trying to deceive you, that you'd be more susceptible.
And would that therefore include a trusted loved one?
Well, I think I would speculate, but.
Then,
Okay.
if it's not within your
Yeah.
purview, I won't ask you that question. Let me turn a little to a couple other questions. A lot of what I've asked you so far has dealt with pointed questions and pointed experiments. Could you indicate how memory either forms, is retained, or is conveyed when we're talking about what I would call routine, or what one usually does, as opposed to a specific event?
Well, one of the things, in one of the studies that we did, we asked people to produce a timeline for something that during a particular time period 3 weeks earlier. And so people went off and first people reported what they were doing. Then they had to try to verify, get evidence for their memory. And in many cases, the memory changed. In close to half of the cases, the memory changed because they found evidence that their original memory was wrong. And what they were trying to do in this study was really remember something they had done 3 weeks earlier. They're often trying to figure out what they usually do. But when they went to try to verify the memory, sometimes they realized that it didn't happen in the usual way.
Could you indicate how did those individuals in that particular study verify what actually had occurred that earlier period versus what they had said?
Well, they may have looked up articles or talked to other people or consulted journals or diaries. However they did it, they were told to go to try to find proof that your memory was accurate. And that's an example of the inaccuracy of memory for presumably fairly mundane events.
Do outside stimuli during questioning or prior to questioning affect people's memory recall later?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by outside stimuli, but if it's external post-event suggestion, which
I'm
can come
thinking of things outside of actual verbiage, outside words. We've talked about that. I'm talking about physical things such as fatigue and whatnot.
Well, we do know something about sleep deprivation, for example, that people are more susceptible to contamination if they are sleep deprived. You know, I'm not sure I've seen a misinformation study where people were hungry, but certainly, you know, if they're preoccupied and stressed and sleep deprived, and that's going to have a negative effect on memory.
Do you have any studies or do you have any opinion about if a person is told repeatedly that they're wrong about their memory, does that have an effect on people's retention of what they had originally stated?
Yes, I mean, when you tell people they're wrong about their memory, I mean, sometimes people will stick to it anyhow and say, I think you're wrong and telling me I'm wrong. But many times they'll change their memory to try to fix what's wrong.
You mentioned fatigue and stress. Does being put in any kind of pressure, being asserted or exerted on a person, play a role in helping or making it difficult for people to remember accurately?
Well, one of the things I've written about is sometimes in psychotherapy, people are pressured to produce more details about some event, to kind of recount more and more. And so you can sometimes then get very kind of elaborate stories, but these are sometimes creations to respond to the pressure for more details.
And does that have, when you say put pressure, does that affect whether or not the detailed recall is more accurate or less accurate?
Well, It's not good for the accuracy to be putting a lot of pressure and to have people want to come up with information just to satisfy that perceived pressure.
Does it matter whether the person that is being subject to interrogation or questioning has any kind of formal education or less education when it comes to later recall, in your experience, in your experiments?
In general, college-educated people have somewhat better memories and are somewhat more resistant to contamination. But I just say somewhat, because even the most educated, intelligent, experienced amongst us has developed false memories for things that have put them in an embarrassing situation.
I just have a moment.
Yes.
Of course, yes. I'm going to ask you just a couple of more general questions, and I'll get a little bit more specific. Could you, I don't think I asked you specifically, how does memory form in the brain?
Well, I can't, all I can tell you is that bits and pieces of experience will enter a memory system. What happens chemically, physiologically, that's beyond my expertise.
But does everyone's memories form the same way? And I don't mean physically, but
Well, people pay attention to different details, and they think about different events soon afterwards, which can reinforce a memory. So you do get individual differences, and some people have better memories than others.
as from your experience and over the years of your training and you've gone to conferences as well that on the issue of memory and the study of information implanted memories, correct? Over the years? You've gone to conferences?
Oh, yeah, yes. Well, I've gone to conferences and I learn about the work of other scientists. I read.
You're not the only person doing this?
No.
Have you given presentations yourself at those conferences?
Hundreds of times, yes.
In your experience, does memory fade over a period of time?
Yes.
Is there any minimum amount of time that takes place before some memory fades?
Well, the fading process will start and continue as more and more time passes.
Well, it'll start, how soon will it start?
Well, it depends on what it is that people are trying to remember. If you've ever been told somebody's name at a party and 2 minutes later you have no idea what their name is, that you know that it can fade pretty fast.
Could it start as quickly as, what was the previous question that had been asked?
Yes, while objections are being discussed.
Okay. And with the time frame, then you said it could be a matter of minutes.
Yes.
As we progress through days, does it expand? That is, does the fading sort of increase in that's a bad question. Let me rephrase the question. Over a period of days, does the memory fading accelerate?
Fading will continue and rendering the memory more susceptible to contamination.
Do post-event conversations and input matter in terms of memory retention?
Yes, they do. I mean, that's one of the ways that somebody's memory gets constructed is that they have conversations with other people. And if those conversations contain accurate information, it can solidify it. If those conversations contain inaccurate information, it acts like post-event information and can solidify the inaccurate information.
You had earlier mentioned media exposure. If there was media involved in the case, writing about the very incident that you were recalling or speaking about in the interim, can that affect a person's memory when they're later recalling?
Yes, media coverage is just one of the ways in which, and we've even studied that in particular with simulated media coverage, but media coverage can lead witnesses to remember details differently than they really happened.
You would also use the term an embarrassing situation could be one factor, outside factor that exposes, or shall we say, can affect memory. What about something more life's change? You know, your life is being turned upside down in some way, such as an arrest.
Well, I would think that would be a stressful situation for a person. We know that life stress, if people are undergoing a lot of life stress, it can interfere with their memory processes.
And would that be even accelerated or exacerbated over a period of months between the first time that someone is asked to recall something and then months later, as much as more than 2 months later, asked to recall certain events and details?
I don't know. I mean, I know that there's a study on life stress and it's how it has a negative effect on memory, but it didn't involve these time periods that you're asking about.
But in general, the longer the period of time, does that show a declining accuracy rate in the memory recall?
Well, people with a lot of life stress are not going to be, their memory is not going to be operating optimally.
Can I just have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Incidentally, you had testified about implanting of certain events and that becomes part of the memory. Earlier you testified to that. Have you yourself been involved in experiments where an event that never happened was implanted and that members of the subjects later recalled it as if it actually did happen?
Yes.
Could you tell the jury about that, please?
So after we had done many, many experiments on the misinformation effect, where you can supply misinformation to a witness and get them to believe, for example, that there was a stop sign controlling the intersection rather than a yield sign, or that the thief was wearing a brown jacket versus a green jacket. We looked for ways to explore whether you could plant an entire event into the mind of someone for something that didn't happen. And the first study to demonstrate this was our study that showed that you could make ordinary people believe and remember when they were 5 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall, they were frightened, they were crying, and ultimately rescued by an elderly person. After we did that study, investigators from different parts of the world came forward and planted these rich false memories, whole memories of things that never happened. You had an accident at a family wedding. You nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. You committed a crime as a teenager and it was serious enough the police actually came to investigate. All of these have been planted into the minds of otherwise ordinary, healthy people through the power of suggestion.
And when these events were later retained or whether recited by those subjects, did they express a level of confidence about it, or were they just saying maybe it happened?
No, many people became quite confident that these made-up events had happened to them. They provided extra details to elaborate on the memory when they were pressured to provide more details.
Even though it was completely false?
I'm sorry.
Even though it was completely false, that memory?
Completely made up, a made-up event.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, I'm sorry.
Did you finish your answer?
I think I did, yes.
I just have a few more questions, I think. Once a person has been implanted from whatever the source with false information and they've conveyed it back, is there any way that you, as an interviewer, can tell whether or not that memory is created or is real from your point of view, other than you knowing the source?
Well, we know in the experiments, but out there in the real world, you don't know, and there is no way to tell. Because once these false memories get planted in the mind of somebody who is, comes to honestly believe it happened, they can be very confident about it, they can be very detailed about it, they can even be emotional about it, even though it didn't happen.
Do the studies show whether or not if that false information is repeatedly conveyed to the person over a period of time, that it sort of cements that false memory?
Yes, repeated misinformation or false information exacerbates the problem.
And you had indicated earlier that there was an experiment involving children. Would that be true of adults as well?
Virtually all my work is with adults. I've collaborated on a few studies with young children. Other investigators specialize in children. Young children, ages like 4 to 6 years old are especially vulnerable to these kinds of influences, but these are phenomena that are true of adults, even adults who are have pretty good memories.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
The court has a few questions, if it may. Professor, have there been studies on the ability of a subject to forcibly forget a memory?
Your Honor, there are studies that, it is true that people can, when something unpleasant happens, people can try to push this out of their mind, distract themselves with other thoughts, not think about things, and that can weaken their memory to some extent. But trying to force someone to forget, one way that might happen is if you're planning something different, then they're gonna, in essence, forget what was originally there.
And finally, from the court, have there been studies or experiments concerning how dreams subsequent to an event about the event may affect memory?
There are studies on dreams. We've actually, we know that sometimes people misremember. They can't remember whether they dreamt something or whether it actually happened. And I believe that dream material, since when you're worrying about something during the day, it can get into your dreams as dream material at night. So it'd be natural for you to be dreaming about something that you're worrying about or upset about. And that you can then maybe have a source confusion between, did I dream it or did I actually do it?
Okay. Are there any questions based on the court's question?
Not from the defense.
Okay,
No, Judge.
cross-examination.
Judge, may we just take the morning recess?
Yes, so we'll take the morning recess and resume. Let's resume.
This honorable Superior Court is now open and back in session. Good morning, Your Honor.
You can bring the jury in, please. Will counsel stipulate, please?
Yes, Judge.
Thank you.
May I proceed, Judge?
Yes.
Doctor, I wanted to just begin with your fee that you were paid in today's case. You indicated on direct examination that you were charging $600 an hour, is that correct?
Yes,
And I believe you indicated on direct examination that you agreed to stick to it.
yes,
And that's because your fee has actually increased, is that correct?
In 2021, I began to charge $700 an hour, yes.
And you were retained in this case in 2020, is that correct?
Yes.
And so you agreed to essentially stick to the original fee?
Exactly,
All right. And your fee has gone up over the years, is that correct?
from when I started in the early 70s, yes.
I think as late as 2012, was your fee $500, do you recall?
I don't remember exactly 2012.
Okay.
It worked its way up.
Right. And how many hours have you worked on this case?
I billed for 11 hours. I spent a few more hours before I traveled to Connecticut yesterday. So, but I probably spent many more than those 11 or 13, 14 hours plus the travel time, because I have viewed a lot of media coverage that I didn't bill for.
Okay, and so as I understand it, you've billed for 11 hours thus far, correct?
Approximately 11 hours so far, yes.
At a rate of $600 an hour?
Yes,
And if I understand your testimony correctly, you did some additional work on the case yesterday?
well, yesterday I traveled from California
Okay.
to Connecticut and worked a number of hours on the case during that travel. and-
During the flight?
In meeting, yes.
Okay. And there was a meeting, I think you indicated?
We had a meeting yesterday after I arrived in Connecticut.
Okay. And you'll be charging for those hours as well, correct?
Yes,
All right. And so that's 14 hours is $600 an hour, is that right?
14 hours before I left California.
Understood. So you're also charging for right now, correct?
I'm charging as you question me, yes?
So the longer I question you, the more money you make?
Yes, but I hope you'll keep it short.
Okay. So we'll see about that. Doctor, you're charging right now. How much do you expect to bill by the time this case is over?
Objection.
Sustained.
Doctor, you indicated that you watched various media in this case, or you looked at media reports, correct?
Yes.
Did you do that on your own, or were you asked to do that by the defense attorney?
Well, it's something that I typically do in a case where there is a lot of media coverage because of the potential for that to influence what people remember.
Thanks, doctor, but I'm just asking if you did that on your own or if the defense attorney specifically asked you to do that in this case.
I don't believe he specifically asked me to do it.
And when you say you don't believe, do you have a recollection one way or the other as you sit here?
I don't have a recollection of him asking me to do that.
Okay, so that was something that you did on your own, correct?
It's something I usually do, and I did in this case.
And Doctor, University of California, Irvine actually allows you to take 1 day a week off so that you can pursue other projects. Is that correct?
That's a typical rule at the universities I've been at, yes.
And your
1 day a
work
week
week-
of outside
Sorry, go ahead.
consulting or whatever.
Right. And a typical work week for you is 5 days a week, I assume?
I work 7 days a week.
Okay. And always for the University of California, Irvine, or also on other projects?
Well, I do consulting, and I do writing, and I do speeches.
So let me try to sharpen my question here.
Okay.
Your responsibility for the University of California, Irvine, you teach classes, I think you said, correct?
That's my full-time job,
Right.
yes.
And that's a 5 day a week job, correct?
Well, it's not exactly, because when we prepare classes, sometimes we do preparations on the weekends. So,
And you were retained in this case. Do you remember the exact date?
I believe, having looked at that document, that it might have been around August, but I'm not sure I remember.
Okay, but you would agree it was some time ago, correct? It was some time ago?
Yes.
That you were retained? And when you said August, just to be clear for the members of the jury, that was August of 2020, correct?
Yes.
And did you know any of the defense lawyers prior to this case?
No,
And were you, you indicated that you had a meeting with the defense attorneys. Was that last night?
yes.
Who did you meet with?
I met with the two attorneys.
And when you say the two attorneys, you're referring to Mr. Schoenhorn and Ms. Felsing, correct?
Yes.
And had you been told by any of the defense attorneys in advance of your review of materials or your testimony that the defendant had inconsistencies in her version of events?
I don't remember if I was told that or not.
Okay. Did you take any notes during any of these meetings?
Well, I didn't take any
object to
notes
the-
yesterday.
The plural meetings, I think she testified there was one meeting last night, so.
I'll rephrase. Last night was not the first time you'd spoken with Mr. Schoenhorn, correct?
Correct. We've had conversations usually telephone over
Right.
the years.
And I think he indicated, you've done consulting on this case, I guess in advance of last night, correct?
Yes.
And during any of those conversations, did you take any notes about what they told you about the defendant's statements?
I may have taken some notes. I don't remember, but I did take notes.
Okay.
It's my custom to take notes when reviewing materials.
Were you told that the defendant changed her story when speaking with the police?
I could see that the story changed.
So,
I wasn't told it. I could see for myself that it changed.
okay, so as I understand your answer, no one told you the story changed, you just observed it yourself, is that correct?
Well, we also had conversations about it changing.
Okay.
I saw it with my own eyes.
And you say we had conversations with the story changing, this is what I'm getting at, that was with Mr. Schoenhorn, correct?
Some of those conversations included the two lawyers and me
Right,
on the
so-
phone together.
Conversations with both lawyers about the defendant's story changing, correct?
Oh, no, I don't remember exactly. We had a number of conversations, but I don't remember whether and somewhere along the way, it's my recollection, we talked about the changes that in the story.
Okay, that was the answer to my question. I was-
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
And how many times would you say you've met with the defense, either in person or via telephone, or I guess Zoom is pretty popular now in academia?
Zoom is popular, but I don't think we did Zoom.
How many times would you say you met with the defense attorney, either over the telephone or in person?
Maybe 4 or 5 times.
And I believe you indicated that in this case, you reviewed transcripts of the defendant's interviews,
And videos.
right? And media reports, correct?
Some media reports, a warrant.
I don't think we heard about the warrant on direct.
I read
Okay.
that too.
And did you review anything else?
Well, I've seen testimony in the trial.
Oh, so you have been watching on television?
I've watched some of the trial, yes.
Okay. And
The hairdresser, I watched,
the hairdresser?
yes.
Okay, she didn't talk about the defendant's statements, did she?
No,
Okay. Did you watch anybody else?
the police officer who found
Well,
the
maybe,
ex-husband,
I guess, did you ever watch any of the defendant's statements on television? For example, Detective Kimball's testimony? Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
Okay. Anything else? Which warrant did you review, by the way?
I don't remember.
Okay, because you
It was a
understand.
long one.
A long one, well, everything in this case has been kind of long.
Okay.
So, do you remember if it was an arrest warrant for conspiracy to commit murder,
I don't remember.
tampering with evidence?
I don't remember.
Okay. Now, Professor, do you consider yourself to be a neutral witness as you sit here today?
Yes,
And you consider yourself to be a scientist, correct?
I am a scientist.
And you would also agree that it's important for a scientist such as yourself who testifies in court not to be an advocate, correct?
I think that that's the ideal situation. Sometimes it's not always an ideal situation because you might develop some personal feelings. I'm human as well as a scientist.
Sure, so I want to just sort of break that down if I could. When you say the ideal situation, why would it be ideal to not be an advocate?
Ideal to not, because you want to present the science fairly and whoever is asking for it.
Now, Doctor, you talked about developing personal feelings. I want to just ask you about a book that you wrote in 1991, if I could. Would you just tell the jury what the title of the book was?
Well, I've published 20 books. Do you want to hand me the CV? And
Well, did you publish more than one book in 1991?
I think only one book in 1991.
So that's
yes.
the one I'm talking about. Would you
Okay.
mind just telling the jury what the title of the book was?
The title of that was Witness for the Defense.
That wasn't the complete title, was it, Doctor?
Well, that was the main part of the title.
So I'll just ask again, that was not the complete title, was it?
Well, there may have been a subtitle, but I don't remember the details. You
Well,
apparently have it, so you can read it
you
to me
don't-
and ask me, is that it?
When you say you don't remember the details, I just want to be clear, you're saying you don't remember the details about the title of a book you wrote?
I don't remember exactly the subtitle,
Okay. So,
because I always call it Witness for the Defense. That's how I usually refer to that book, the main title.
now, if I were to show you a photocopy of the cover of your book, do you think that would help you remember what the subtitle was?
Yes,
May I have the smart judge?
Yes.
Doctor, I was going to ask if you wouldn't just mind reading this assignment to yourself and tell me if that refreshes your recollection as to what the subtitle was.
yes.
Doctor, what was the subtitle?
Let me think. It was the accused, the eyewitness, and the memory expert on trial or something. Could you show it to me again?
You need to refresh your memory again?
Well,
on that?
it's a long subtitle, and I just want to make sure I get it 100% accurate.
No, understood. There's some procedural things I have to do, so you need your memory refreshed again as
Well,
to the subtitle?
something about the accused, the eyewitness, and the expert who puts memory on trial.
Oh, you got it that time.
Okay, good,
Wow.
thank you, good.
And doctor, when you said the eyewitness who puts memory on trial, the expert who puts the memory on trial, you were referring to yourself, correct?
Well, that book is about my scientific work and the work in trials, some of the trials that I've been involved in, yes.
How does an expert like yourself put, quote, memory on trial?
Experts who specialize in memory, who get involved in court cases, often present scientific information about memory to educate a jury or a judge, a trier of fact, about the science of memory. That's what we do.
Okay.
I and hundreds of others.
And doctor, you talked about this issue of being an advocate in that book. Do you remember that?
I don't. It was so long ago. You'll have to.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you say in this book, should a psychologist in a court of law act as an advocate for the defense or an impartial educator? My answer to that question, if I am completely honest, is both. Do you remember making that statement in your book?
Well, I'll take your word for it that you're reading something I wrote in 1991 that.
Well, doctor, I certainly don't want you to take my word for it, okay? So do you need your memory refreshed again?
Well, I don't remember everything I've written in 600 papers and 20 books.
Sure,
from
I know you're very
decades
accomplished.
ago.
I know you're very accomplished. My question, though, is do you need your memory refreshed again?
Well, I would take your word for it that I wrote something about that.
Okay, but you don't have a recollection as you sit here, correct?
No.
Okay, so,
Well, I'm going to object. She didn't say that anything would refresh her memory about something she wrote in 1991, so I object to him and showing her the document.
doctor, it would help you
Well,
remember.
there's an objection. So the witness has said, essentially, showing her what she wrote in 1991 will not refresh her recollection about what she wrote in 1991. But she did not deny writing it. So what's the next question?
Doctor, earlier when I showed you the cover of the book, that helped you remember the title, correct?
Well, I could read I could read it.
Right. So do you think that this, reading your own book, might help refresh your recollection as to what you said back in 1991?
Your Honor, if Mr. McGinnis wants to offer these pages, I'm not objecting, so we could move along and have it being admitted as an exhibit, so.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I just want her to answer my question. Would reading your
What you
own...
want is not relevant, it's not material, and it's not necessary. The question has been, would this refresh your recollection? The answer is no. But she didn't deny writing it. What's the next question?
Well, I'm going to offer this, Judge.
No objection.
So this is State's Exhibit 153.
153 admitted as full.
Doctor, I'm just going to ask if you wouldn't mind, if you could just read this particular paragraph aloud to the jury.
Oh, okay. Starting with should a psychologist?
Yes, ma'am.
So, should a psychologist in a court of law act as an advocate for the defense or an impartial educator? My answer to that question, if I'm completely honest, is both. I believe a defendant, if I believe a defendant is innocent, if I believe in his innocence with all my heart and soul, then I probably can't help but become an advocate of sorts.
Doctor, now having been given the benefit of reading that, does that refresh your memory as to what you said about being an advocate in court?
Well, I see that those are the pages from my book, and that's what I wrote 30 years ago, or whenever that was.
And do you agree with the statement that if you're being completely honest, the answer is both?
I guess I do agree with that.
And do you agree with the statement, if I believe a defendant is innocent, if I believe in his innocence with all my heart and soul, then I probably can't help but become an advocate of sorts? Do you agree with that?
I guess I do agree with that.
Now, you were asked on direct examination how many times you've testified in court, and I think you indicated over 300 times, correct?
Approximately, yes.
Sure. Doctor, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question to that, which is, of those 300 times that you've testified in court, how many times has it been for the state or the prosecution?
Well, of those 300 times, again, this is just an estimate, maybe half of them are civil cases where I would testify either for the plaintiff or the defense, depending on the case, and the other half are criminal cases. And although I've been asked to consult with the prosecution 5 or 6 times, I've actually only testified for the prosecution once in those criminal cases. So the large majority has been on behalf of the defense. I was called on behalf of the defense.
Right, and I think you indicated that you have a degree in mathematics, so if we divide 300 by 2, that means you've testified approximately 150 times in criminal cases, correct?
Approximately.
And that means that out of those approximate 150 times, you've testified 1 time for the prosecution, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that the reason you don't get hired more by the prosecution is because you've written a book called Witness for the Defense?
I'm going to object speculation
Well, it's
and
argumentative, sustained.
Doctor, I guess I'll hand this back to you. I want to just direct your attention to the top of that page. That's from that same book in 1991, correct?
Yes.
And did you write in that book that you'd never met a prosecutor who was happy to see you in the courtroom?
What paragraph is that?
So if you would just direct your attention near the top, I think it's the first full paragraph.
I don't see what you're asking.
I'm just going to direct your attention to this sentence here.
Oh, I see. Okay, I wrote that, yes.
Okay, that a prosecutor would never be happy to see you in the courtroom, correct?
I'd never met a prosecutor who was happy to see me in a courtroom. Actually, it happened today, though.
So, Doctor, when you say it happened today, we met very briefly before court, correct?
But I met your colleague, too.
Okay. And, Doctor, why would a prosecutor never be happy to see you in a courtroom?
If I'm, generally, if somebody is testifying as an expert for the defense, prosecutors come into this with a challenging, MO, and they are not usually that happy to see defense expert witnesses.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you about MOs. I guess you meant modus operandi? Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Okay. When you write a book called Witness for the Defense, does that show your MO?
Well, that.
Your Honor, I'm
because-
going to object that it's argumentative.
Well, It's argumentative, sustained.
Doctor, who did you dedicate this book to?
I don't recall now. You'll have to refresh my memory.
Sure. I'm going to show you the dedication. And I'm just going to ask that you read that out loud to the jury.
We dedicate this book to the women and men who've been wrongfully accused, convicted, imprisoned, or have otherwise suffered because of faulty eyewitness testimony.
There's nothing in that acknowledgement about victims in your dedication, is there?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
No.
And would you also agree that a hard copy of your book has a number of photos in it?
Yes.
And you would agree that the photos include Ted Bundy?
There is a photo of Ted Bundy, I believe, yes.
And who's Ted Bundy?
Well, in 1976, Ted Bundy was a first-year law student at the University of Utah Law School, and he was accused in an aggravated kidnapping.
And you testified on his behalf, correct?
I was called as a defense witness about the police procedures in that case.
And then Mr. Bundy went on to be convicted of numerous other crimes,
Objection,
correct?
irrelevant.
Well, the question first was, who was Ted Bundy? The answer, he was a law student at the University of Utah. But that's not the complete story. So the court is going to overrule the objection.
Let me ask you this, did he graduate law school?
I don't think so, no.
And the reason he didn't graduate law school in part was because he ended up getting arrested for other crimes, correct?
He did, yes. He
What were those crimes?
Well, he was convicted in the aggravated kidnapping in Utah. Then he was extradited to stand trial for another case in Colorado. He escaped from jail in Colorado, and he ended up committing terrible crimes in Florida, and he was executed.
And I also wanted to talk to you about some of your other past clients. You have done work on Timothy McVeigh's case, correct?
I consulted on that case. I did not testify.
Right. And when you say you consulted for the defense, correct?
I did, yes.
And that means that you were assisting them in preparing a defense for Timothy McVeigh, correct?
I was advising them about memory issues, and I actually got to meet Timothy McVeigh in prison.
Was he a nice guy?
He was nice to me.
Argumentative, sustained.
You also have worked on O.J. Simpson's case, correct?
I consulted on that case. I did not testify.
And O.J. Simpson has been arrested a couple of times as well. Just to be clear, which case did you work on?
I consulted on some DNA issues in that case, the accusation of murder of his wife.
Someone else was murdered as well, correct?
Yes,
Ronald Goldman?
yes.
Okay. Now, you also worked on the Menendez brothers case?
I consulted on that in that case, but I did not testify.
And the Menendez brother, I mean, and again, when you say consulted, I want to be clear, on both O.J. Simpson and the Menendez brothers, you were consulting on behalf of the defense,
The
correct?
defense contacted me for consultation, yes.
Right. And when you say consultation, what you really mean is you were discussing memory issues with them to help them prepare their defense, correct?
To help them understand the memory issues in their case.
As part of the defense, correct?
Well, I was consulted, but did
Your Honor,
not
I'm gonna
testify.
object. She's testified about memory, not the character of the people that the lawyers who
Well,
contacted her.
this is not an objection. This is just essentially a speaking objection. What's the grounds?
Well, irrelevant and cumulative
Well,
and immaterial.
the this line of questioning goes to whether or not essentially this witness has a bias for the defense. So you can ask the question again, counsel.
Doctor, when you say you're consulting for Mr. Simpson, consulting for the Menendez brothers, you indicated that you were discussing memory issues in their case, correct?
With the attorney,
Right. For the defense, correct?
attorney representing those accused, yes.
And you understood that the people that were representing the accused were trying to prepare a defense for them at trial, correct?
Well, I presume that's what they're doing, yeah.
And that's what you were doing, correct?
I was answering their questions about memory.
And you also worked on the Michael Jackson case, correct?
2 of his cases, yes. I did not testify in either one.
And when you say 2 of his cases, he was arrested twice?
Yeah, there was one trial in the 90s and another one in the 2000s.
Okay, and so you worked for him twice?
I was contacted by the defense in those 2 cases.
Right. Phil Spector, you worked on his case as well, correct?
I testified in that case, yes.
Right. And when you say you testified, I just want to be clear, you testified on behalf of Phil Spector, correct?
I was called by the
You testified on
defense.
behalf of the defense, not on behalf of an individual.
Well, all we need, counsel, is the objection.
Check the form of the question.
Sustained.
You testified on behalf of the defense who was representing Phil Spector, correct?
Yes,
And that was in 2009?
roughly, yes.
What was he accused of doing?
A murder.
Who did he allegedly murder?
Objection irrelevant.
Well,
I'll withdraw it. You also worked on Jerry Sandusky's case, correct?
Primarily, I was working on behalf of the administrators at Penn State who were accused of maybe not doing more, you could say. But that was my primary work in the Penn State case. Then after their situation resolved and I was not in any kind of conflict, I did talk with Mr. Sandusky's defense attorneys, yes.
So that was a very long answer to a simple question. My
well,
own,
that's not a question. Now, what the court is going to do is this. The court understands zeal. The court understands the cut and thrust of cross. But what the court is not going to countenance is a lack of respect.
may I proceed?
Yes.
Doctor, the short answer to my question was that you worked on Jerry Sandusky's case, correct?
Yes,
And Jerry Sandusky was accused of molesting children, is that right?
yes,
You also worked on Bill Cosby's case, correct?
yes.
And what did you do for Bill Cosby?
I consulted on a case that he was facing in Pennsylvania. I testified in a civil case involving Mr. Cosby in California.
And did you testify on Mr. Cosby's behalf in that case?
I was called by the defense attorney.
And was Mr. Cosby the defendant?
He was.
You also worked on the Harvey Weinstein case, correct?
One of them, yes.
And which one did you work on?
The New York case,
And you testified in that case as well, correct?
yes.
And you were called by the defense attorney, correct?
I was called by his defense attorney, yes.
And you worked on the Robert Durst case?
Yes,
And Robert Durst was a real estate agent or something like this who was accused of murder in California?
he was accused of murder,
Right. And you testified in that case, correct?
yes.
And when you testified, you were called by the defense attorney, correct?
One of the attorneys representing Mr. Durst, yes.
Did you believe any of those individuals were victims of false memory and bad identifications?
Well, there are different facts surrounding different ones of those individuals. But I do have my personal opinions, but some of them didn't do some of the things they were accused of, even if they did other things that they were accused of.
And so, were you acting as an advocate in those cases or a neutral witness?
I was answering questions about memory, except in the OJ case, which was about DNA.
Now, Doctor, is it fair to say that you have built a lucrative career coming into court and testifying in criminal cases?
It's fair to say that I'm compensated for my time, just as you are.
How much do you think I make $700 an hour?
We're going to take a recess because things are becoming unhinged. Recess. council stipulate, please?
Yes, Judge.
Yes.
Doctor, you mentioned on direct examination that you have collaborated with Charles Morgan in doing memory research with United States soldiers. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you had talked about some of the experiments. I think you indicated you had done 2 experiments.
I think we've co-authored 2 separate papers. I don't remember how many experiments are within a paper.
Understood. Is one of those papers, Misinformation Can Influence Memory for Recently Experienced Highly Stressful Events?
That sounds familiar, yes.
Would it be helpful if I gave you a copy if we're going to talk about it?
Yes.
Okay. May I have this marked, Judge?
Yes.
This states 154 for ID. Doctor, is that the one of the papers that you co-authored in connection with those experiments?
Yes.
All right. And I wanted to, if you need to reference it, feel free. I'm not intending on introducing it just at
Okay.
this point. But I wanted to ask you about the aggressive interrogation method that you spoke about on direct examination, if I could. But before I do, I want to ask you, the soldiers themselves, I believe you indicated that it's an exercise in which they're captured as prisoners of war.
That's what this survival school is about, training them so they know what to expect if they're ever captured as prisoners of war.
And as part of the training, they undergo an interrogation after they're captured, is that correct?
Yes.
And prior to being captured, do they spend some time isolated, if you recall?
I don't recall this exact protocol versus
Okay.
the other one in the other paper or any of the ones that he has been the chief investigator for, but
And when they're interrogated, you mentioned that it can be aggressive. In fact, the soldiers can actually be slapped in the face during the interrogation, correct?
yes,
And in your review, there was no evidence of that in this case, correct? During any of the defendant's interrogations?
correct.
And during the interrogations with the soldiers, they can actually be punched in the stomach, is that correct?
They can be punched, yes.
In the stomach more specifically, correct?
If the paper said that, it's been a while. This is 2013, so,
Certainly you agree they can be punched, correct?
yes,
No evidence of that in this case,
No.
correct? The soldiers in those experiments can be thrown against the wall during the interrogation, correct?
yes,
And there's no evidence of that in this case, correct?
correct.
So the type of interrogation that's done there somewhat different than a normal police interrogation, would you agree?
Well, yes, this was a very aggressive experience, as they might experience if they were captured by an enemy.
Sure, so it's
Yes.
actually designed to be more aggressive, is that correct?
Yes.
And Doctor, would you agree that there is a correlation between intelligence and memory?
There is some correlation, yes.
People with higher education levels tend to have better memories, according to the studies, is that correct?
Statistically, yes.
Doctor, did you ever determine in this case whether or not the defendant graduated high school?
I don't know that, no.
Okay, did you ever ask that of the defense attorneys whether or not she had graduated high school?
I don't recall having that discussion.
Doctor, I assume if you don't know whether or not she graduated high school, you also don't know whether or not she graduated college, correct?
I don't know.
Okay. And you didn't ask that question of the defense attorneys either, correct?
I don't recall having that discussion.
Could that information have been helpful to you in your analysis of this case?
I'm not sure. I mean, usually more information is better, but it wouldn't change anything that I testified to today.
No, I understand. I'm just asking, and I think you answered it, which is more information is always better, correct?
Typically,
And that's because someone with a higher education level could have a better memory in part, correct?
Statistically, that's been shown in these studies, yes.
Do you know whether or not the defendant has employment history?
I don't recall.
Okay, could that information have also been helpful to you in your analysis of this case?
It would not have changed anything I testified about.
So just to be clear, it would not have been helpful or it would have been helpful?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. And so, for example, if she had an extensive work history, that could potentially mean that she has a higher intelligence level, potentially, correct?
I would not want to give an opinion about that.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you, you would agree that there is another possible explanation other than memory contamination for inconsistencies in the defendant's statements, correct?
Correct?
One possible explanation could be that the defendant was simply lying to the police, correct?
That's possible?
And you would agree that sometimes people who are accused of crimes lie to the police.
Yes?
And sometimes people who are accused of crimes change their stories in an effort to explain their conduct. Is that correct?
Well, certainly people who do commit crimes or deny that they do.
I'm sorry, I missed your answer.
They deny that they do.
Right, but sometimes they also learn what the police information is and then try to change their story. Is that correct? To try to tailor their...
That can happen.
Now, I want to direct your attention now to the defendant's June 1st, 2019 interview. You indicated that you reviewed the transcript of that interview. Is that correct?
I did, yes.
And do you recall what the defendant initially told the police in that interview about Mr. Dulos' whereabouts on May 24th?
I believe she did, yes.
And what do you recall about what she said?
That they were together in the house,
Okay. And specifically that they had taken a shower together, correct?
yes,
And I wanted to ask you, which police officer or detective in that interview suggested that information to her?
I'm going to object. I didn't ask any questions about the specifics. To ask which detective said what is not part of the direct, and therefore it's outside the scope.
Well, the question is, as the court understands it, identify the detective who asked her about certain matters. Or does this witness remember which detective? Well, this may lead into another inquiry, so the court will overrule the objection.
Well, actually, maybe I'll just sharpen my question a bit, Judge. Maybe it'll help. Doctor, when you reviewed the interview, did you see any detective suggest to the defendant, prior to her saying it, that she had seen Mr. Dulos in the house on May 24th?
no. They told her that they had absolute scientific evidence that her memory was wrong.
So,
They accused her of lying.
so I'm referring specifically to the June 1st interview, and the defendant was given an opportunity to explain her whereabouts on May 24th, correct?
I'm going to object. There is not a June 1st interview.
June 2nd interview. The defendant was given an opportunity to explain her whereabouts on May 24th, correct?
Yes,
And she explained her whereabouts, is that correct?
yes,
Prior to her explaining her whereabouts, did you see any detective on the video suggest to her that she had been with Mr. Dulos in the house?
no,
Prior to her explaining her whereabouts, did you see any detective on the video suggest to her that she had taken a shower with Mr. Dulos?
no,
Prior to her explaining her whereabouts, did you see any detective suggest that she had seen Mr. Dulos in the four-group office with Kent Mawhinney?
no,
Doctor, the defendant also claimed in that interview that she had returned a purse to her friend's husband that day. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
Okay. I want you to assume that she did. say that during her first interview, okay? Just for purposes of this exercise, all right?
Okay,
Do you know whether or not that information was ever verified?
I don't know.
Okay. So you can't tell us whether or not that was something which was suggested to her or something that was a genuine memory, is that
I
correct?
don't know.
The defendant also told police that she had bought parsley at a grocery store, correct?
I don't recall that specific detail.
Just for the purposes of this examination, I want you to assume that she did. I take it that you don't know whether or not that information was ever verified?
I don't know.
Okay. I want you to assume that both those things were in fact verified, okay? The friend's husband indicated that she did in fact return the purse, and there's actually a Stop and Shop receipt indicating that she had purchased parsley, all right? I want you to assume those facts for just a moment, okay? That could be evidence that her memory was correct, true?
It could be.
Okay. So if that were true, any stress that she was going through did apparently not accurately, or excuse me, it's a bad question. If that were true, any stress that she was apparently going through as part of the arrest didn't impact her ability to recite those details correctly, correct?
Well, she could be producing some accurate details. I mean, even if you are highly stressed, it doesn't mean you can't remember anything.
Right, and sometimes people remember bigger details than smaller details. Would that be fair to say?
Things that are important to them, perhaps.
Right, so there's something I think you call central details and peripheral details. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you would agree a central detail might be going to the grocery store, and a peripheral detail might be buying parsley at the grocery store.
Well, it really depends on all the other things that are relevant.
Okay, so you, okay.
Maybe going to the grocery store wasn't particularly central.
Okay. Was there, you indicated that you looked at media reports in connection with this case, is that correct?
Yes, over these years, lots of media.
Was there a news report addressing the defendant's whereabouts prior to June 2nd, 2019? Let me rephrase my question. Was there a news report detailing the defendant's whereabouts on the morning of May 24th, 2019, prior to her arrest on June 2nd?
I don't recall one.
So any implantation of false memories couldn't have come from any news reports, is that correct?
Objection. The question had with about her as opposed to someone else.
Well, the question had to do with whether there was a news report of essentially the defendant's whereabouts on May 24th.
Your Honor, the last question was any news reports, not just about her, so it was a lack of foundation regarding that question. The previous question was about her.
Well, this is the court's understanding of the question. The court's understanding is whether or not there were reports in the media about the defendant's whereabouts on May 24th, 2019, and this is implied, and it may not be the correct implication, that the defendant could have read about. That's how the court understood the question.
That's correct, Judge. And also specifically the morning of May 24th.
Overruled. The objection's overruled.
What was your question again?
Were there any news reports prior to the defendant's arrest on the night of June 1st, 2019, that detailed her whereabouts on the morning of May 24th?
I don't recall any.
Were there any news reports prior to June 1st, 2019, when the defendant was arrested, that indicated the defendant had seen Mr. Dulos in the foregroup office?
I don't recall that detail.
Were there any news reports, same time period, that indicated the defendant had showered with Mr. Dulos on the morning of May
I
24th?
don't recall seeing that in the news.
Doctor, are you aware that the defendant had written timelines in this case?
Yes.
And in fact, Doctor, what is your understanding of when those timelines were written?
Well, it's my understanding that very early on, the estranged husband was a suspect, and a lawyer suggested that they put together a timeline of where they were in the time period surrounding the disappearance, and that they together worked on that timeline.
So let me ask it a different way. When is your understanding that the defendant wrote her timeline? Was it prior or after her arrest?
Well, I had the impression that the two of them had worked on trying to kind of reconstruct what happened and make a timeline, that they did that together, talking with each other.
No, and I appreciate that, Doctor, but my question simply is, was it your understanding prior or after she was arrested?
It's my understanding it was before the June 2nd interview.
Right. And you indicated that it was your understanding that the defendant and Mr. Dulos worked on these timelines together. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Didn't the defendant in her June 6th interview deny that she had spoken with Mr. Dulos about her timeline?
I don't recall that, but it's my understanding they worked on those timelines together.
And Doctor, if she wrote this timeline before she was arrested on June 1st, she couldn't have been threatened by the police yet, is that correct?
No,
She couldn't have been sleep deprived by the police, is that correct?
no,
Okay. She couldn't have had, I forget the term you used, post-event information from the police yet, is that correct?
that came later.
Right. And when you say it came later, just to be clear, it came after they had written the timelines, correct?
That's my understanding.
Doctor, do you agree with the general proposition that just because someone is emotional when recounting an event, that doesn't mean their memory about the event is authentic?
Yes,
Do you also agree with the general proposition that just because someone is emotional when recounting an event does not mean they're actually telling the truth about it?
correct.
So, do you also agree, Doctor, that human beings have the mental capacity to lie?
Yes,
And did you consider that possibility in your analysis in this case at all?
it's certainly the prosecution's theory of what happened, and mine was an alternative theory that it was not lying.
Right. I'm just asking a question, though, which is, did you consider that possibility in your own analysis?
It remains a possibility.
Okay. And, Doctor, did you review the defendant's third interview on August 13th, 2023,
Yes.
2019?
Yes,
You did. And the defendant was asked whether or not she was ready to admit not being 100% truthful with investigators in her first two interviews. Do you recall that question?
I don't recall that exact question, no.
Do you recall that she answered yes to a question of that nature?
Well, what I recall is that she was saying maybe she made a mistake, but she wasn't lying.
So you don't recall whether or not she indicated yes when asked that question?
No,
Okay. Does that impact your analysis at all, the fact that she said yes when answering that
I'm going to
question?
object because she didn't say that. She said what the witness said, and I object to Mr. McGinnis testifying.
Well, the court's understanding of the question really is this. If the defendant said that she was not 100% truthful, even though this witness did not remember reading that, would that have affected this witness's analysis? Witness's analysis, that's the question. If that's the question, overruled.
That is the question, Judge.
and the question is?
So you don't, okay. Doctor, the question is, if the defendant had in fact told police investigators in response to the question whether or not she was prepared to admit she had not been 100% truthful, and and her answer was yes, would that have impacted your analysis in this case?
It would not change anything I said in my earlier testimony, but it does raise in my mind how she interpreted that question when if she's being asked, were you 100% truthful, does she mean that she wasn't 100% accurate? And that's what she was trying to say? From the rest of the testimony, it appears that she may have been trying to say, it might not have been accurate, but I wasn't lying.
And doctor, did you ever ask the defense attorneys for the opportunity to speak with the defendant herself and ask her that question, what she meant?
No.
Could that information have been helpful to you in your analysis since you're not sure?
Well, I'm not making a decision about whether she was lying or made an honest mistake. That's up to the jury.
So my question is, could that information have been helpful to you, though, in your analysis?
It wouldn't have changed anything I said earlier in this testimony.
Doctor, at one point, do you recall the defendant being asked why she hadn't provided information previously in that August 13th interview?
She was asked that question, yes.
And do you remember at one point she said, because you didn't ask?
And your question is, yes?
So my question is, do you remember her saying that to the police at one
I
point?
vaguely remember something like that, yes.
Okay. Did that impact your analysis here today?
No?
Okay. Doctor, the defendant provided additional details during that third interview to police. Is that correct?
She had details in the third interview.
And one of the details was that she had taken a brown-stained paper towel from Mr. Dulos and thrown it out. Do you remember that?
I don't.
Okay, I want you to assume that she had said that, okay? Was there any point in the interview prior to that where a detective suggested to her that she had taken a brown-stained paper towel from Mr. Dulos?
Not that I recall.
Doctor, the defendant also indicated that Mr. Dulos had told her he spilt coffee. Do you recall that? Was there any point in the interview prior to her indicating that Mr. Dulos had told her she had spilled coffee that a detective suggested that to her?
I don't recall that.
Doctor, during the third interview, the defendant indicated that her and Mr. Dulos were having physical contact on the passenger side of the Tacoma. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
I want you to assume that she had said that, all right?
Okay.
At any point in the interview prior to her saying that, had a detective suggested that information to her?
I don't recall that, no.
Doctor, do you know whether or not the defendant had eaten prior to the August 13th, 2019 interview?
I don't recall.
Did you ever ask that question of either of the defense attorneys, whether or not she had eaten?
I don't recall having that conversation.
Did you ever ask either of the defense attorneys whether or not she was sleep deprived before going into that third interview on August 13th?
I think the sleep deprivation was on the earlier ones.
Okay, so my question though was whether or not you asked if she was sleep deprived going into the third interview.
I don't recall that.
Could that information have been helpful to you in your analysis today?
It wouldn't have changed anything I said earlier in my testimony.
And doctor, just to be clear, you understand that it's the jury's role to determine who is or is not telling the truth in this case, correct?
Objection.
Grounds.
I'll withdraw the objection.
You understand that?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much.
Could we just very brief redirect? Could I have, no, mine is it. I'm going to approach and give you Exhibit SS, and I'm just going to ask you, this is the agreement that was signed with my office, with me personally.
Yes.
And I'm just going to ask you to read aloud one sentence, beginning with the word payment. Just read that sentence
Okay.
aloud.
It says, "Payment to business associate is not dependent on the findings which it renders, nor on the outcome of any legal action, nor on any contractual arrangement between the client attorney and any other person or party."
And were you the business associate in this case?
Yes.
Was that entered into before you gave me any opinion about the particular case?
Well, I would have given you my honest opinion, no matter what.
You were given a long list of individuals that you had been consulting with the attorneys or in a few cases had testified to. Were you ever asked in those cases to be a character witness for those individuals?
No.
Did you testify about about memory and the science of memory in those cases?
When I did testify, yes.
And did you give your objective opinion based on the science in those cases?
Yes.
And did you get paid for your testimony in those cases, for the ones that were just read by Mr. McGinnis?
Some of them.
Were you asked to give an opinion about Michelle Troconis?
No.
By the way, you were asked several questions about the book you wrote in 1991. At that point in your career, had you been involved in cases where it turned out people had been falsely convicted and later exonerated?
Yes. Yes.
And had you testified in those cases for people getting new trials or having their convictions overturned?
I had testified many times for the defense prior to publishing that 1991 book.
In your science, do people sometimes remember certain details but not others?
Yes.
Can pressure lead to findings of false memory?
Pressure can lead people to produce details, and sometimes what gets produced in response to the pressure is accurate, but sometimes it's not.
Do you find in your both your experiments and in your field that even people of high intelligence are subject to post-event contamination of memory?
Absolutely.
And you were asked some questions about whether or not Ms. Troconis had graduated from high school or graduated from a college. Does that affect your opinion on whether or not people who have higher education can in fact also be subject to post-event memory contamination?
No,
Do you know anything about the quality of education in South America?
I don't.
You've never been asked to lecture or investigate the level of education in either South American high schools or colleges, have you?
No, I've lectured in South America, but not about education, about memory.
Incidentally,
Well, before you go on,
I have two more questions, Your Honor. May I?
Yes.
Thank you. You indicated that you consulted in many cases that you did not testify to. What, did you consult with federal government agencies as an expert in the field of memory?
Yes,
Could you just
many times.
tell the jury where you
Well, I
consulted?
did mention in my earlier testimony having consulted with the Secret Service, the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency. I've lectured to these groups about proper interviewing techniques and about the memory of witnesses and victims. With the CIA, I actually had a contract to advise them about how the work on misinformation might relate to some intelligence activities that they are involved in.
Was the CIA, unless it's secret, involved in planting of false information at the time?
No, they were not wanting to know how to do it, but how to recognize it.
Okay, and that's what you were consulting on,
Yes.
correct? Is that correct?
Yes.
And I just have one final question. If called by the prosecution, would your testimony be any different about the science you testified to today?
No, in the one case where I did testify for the prosecution, a murder case in Wisconsin, similar testimony.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
I have nothing, Judge.
Thank you. Professor, you may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Attorney Schoenhorn, do you have witnesses for this afternoon?
I do, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll stand in our luncheon recess. We'll resume at 2:10. Please do not discuss the vote.
Stay seated until the jury leaves.